Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. This is episode 2 of What Did I Read This Month. So I did one for January of 2022, all the books that I had read that month, and this is for February of 2022. I'm going to go through like the reading stats like I did for last month, and then we'll go through what my favorite books were, and I have some really great reviews, some bad reviews, and some positive reviews, so this is a fun month I'm looking forward to. So in total, I finished 8 books this month. 3 of those were actual paperback books, so an improvement from last month, and 5 of them were audiobooks. And I really enjoyed a lot of the audiobooks that I listened to this month. So in total, that was almost 3,000 pages, 2,885 pages, and I'm going to go through a list of all the ones that I read, and I'm going to kind of give you a little review, a couple sentences on each one of them. But first, this month was actually not the greatest month because I did not finish, DNF'd, 2 different books. So I started listening to After She Falls, which is a Christian fiction book. I had seen a good review on it, so I started listening to it, and it was just too emotional and too Christian fiction-y for me, so I decided to just quit listening to that. So then I started a book called Things We Cannot Say, and it's a historical fiction that kind of goes back and forth between World War II Poland and then modern day. There were some things that I didn't really like in it, but I was like, okay, I can push through, and then I got to a point there was just a lot of language all of a sudden, so I would not recommend that book if you see it floating around on like popular shelves. Those are 2 books I would not recommend reading. Okay, so the books that I did like this month, we have, let's see, starting from the beginning of the month, Fox by Nadine Brandes. That's a Christian fiction book, and it is actually historical, so about the gunpowder plot by Guy Fawkes, and it's not like entirely historical accurate, but it's kind of allegorical, which I really like the whole fantasy magic part of it that lines up with like the Protestant Catholic, so there's a depth to the story, and I really enjoyed reading it. That was a really fun book to read. Then The Mountain Between Us, I rated that one 4 stars. So that one, I actually really didn't like it until the very end, because you don't figure something out, like the main point of the whole story, you don't even figure it out until the very end of the book, and so you go through it like, oh, I don't like this, I don't like what's happening, and then it's like you get the key at the end. So I can't really say much without spoiling it, but I would read it again because I think I would enjoy it better the second time knowing the ending, if that makes sense. But the author of that is such a good author, so I can't wait to read more of his books. It's Charles Martin, and I would definitely actually recommend that book. Just know that you'll be very surprised at the end. Then the next book I read was Gentle and Lowly, and I'm not really going to say much about it because there's a lot of other videos on my channel about it, but I do really like that book, and I give it 5 stars. This was my second read through, and I finished it in February. And then the next book is A Time to Die, also by Nadine Brandes. I really enjoyed reading it. The only thing that I would have a problem with is I feel like I'm very sensitive to violence and like disturbing images in a book. And I feel like she kind of adds things that are just gross and just kind of make your stomach clench, because not necessarily violent, but just disturbing is the best way to put it. So I didn't like that about this book, but basically it's what would your life be like if you knew when you were going to die. So everyone has a clock that tells them, okay, you had this many hours, minutes left to die, and basically the whole book is just her like thinking that she's going to die at the end, and how is she going to live that life. It was very interesting, and you definitely start thinking about your own life. Okay, like how would I live this? And I did enjoy this book. I thought it was really just an interesting idea that this author had, and I can't wait to read the rest of this series. I think there's 2 other books, and I'm really interested in those. There were some really good quotes that I loved in this book, like one part, so if you know that someone's going to die at a certain time, then what is the point of loving them and getting close to them if you know that they're just going to be ripped away from you, or you're going to be taken away from them? And there's a quote that said, love them as hard as you can before you lose them. So you never know when someone's going to die. Even that's realistic now. We don't know when someone's going to die, so love them as hard as we can, because you don't know when the last time you'll have with them. So I really like that part. Other things I didn't like about it was there's a lot of like God speaking to her, which in the beginning it's like, oh, I can ignore this, maybe it's just kind of weird, but then there's one part that's very, like, explicit, like, oh, I heard God's voice. I thought that was very odd, out of place, unneeded. And then there's, like, yeah, stomach churning, like, pain. And I also really liked how there was some attraction, a little bit of love in the book, but it was handled in a really interesting, like, Christian perspective. It wasn't just overwhelming, and I kind of agreed with what she said about it. So I thought that was really cool. And if you're listening to it on audiobook, I would highly recommend doing that, because the narrator is really good. I don't like the way that she portrays the main character, Parvin. Her voice isn't the greatest, but the narrator is so emotional and makes you, like, really feel what the words are saying. So I really like that book. Okay, moving on to the next book, Crime and Punishment. I finished it this month. It took me, let's see, I finished it on the 20th, so that took me like 50 days to read it. And I have a lot to say about this book. I will probably have to do another episode on it. I gave it 2 stars. And when I finished it, I definitely didn't like it. I felt nauseated through the whole time, and I listened to a podcast on it talking about it, which helped me to like it a little bit more, because you can appreciate that they wrote books where every single thing had a meaning, and every character was meant to show you something and meant to foil another character, and in that way, it's a beautiful book. It's amazing, like all classics are. But I did not like a lot of the things in there, and just the way that the feeling of the book was the whole time, and it's a big book, and you don't even have a happy ending. Some people might say, oh, it ends so well, but basically I found the moral of the story to be like, oh, a guy can be saved through loving this girl, and the love doesn't even make sense, and the whole book, there's no repentance. It's odd. I did learn that the names, Russian names, you pronounce the penultimate syllable, which makes sense because every other language except for English, basically you do that. And I learned listening to this podcast. I would highly recommend, if you don't like a book, especially a classic book, go watch a video or listen to a podcast that kind of explains what is happening in the book and what the significance of each of the characters are. So then at least you can appreciate it even if you don't necessarily love it. So this book was actually really based on Dostoevsky's own experience in Siberia. So if you don't know, in Russia at the time, whenever the czars or can't think of the communist leader would get mad at the citizens, he would send them to Siberia, to the Gulag, as punishment. And that is, the book ends there. And so Dostoevsky spent his own time there, and it kind of changed the way he lived his life. So he wrote this book based on his own experiences. So the main character is Raskolnikov, I think is how you say it. Don't get mad at me for saying these names wrong. I struggle with pronouncing this. So he has this idea of murdering someone who's no good to society and then using her money to benefit society. But ironically, he doesn't do anything with money, and he ends up just causing more harm to society by being this murderer. And you see that even if you think that you're doing a sin for the right reason, it's not actually going to turn out right. Then you have, like, St. Petersburg. One little point about that was that, so you just feel this grossness the whole book, and Dostoevsky purposely did that because St. Petersburg, at that time, all the serfs had been freed, and so there were so many people flooding into St. Petersburg, and we think of Russia as really cold, but that's the far eastern side of Russia, but the western side, where St. Petersburg is, can actually get really hot. So the whole book is on purpose very sweltering and pushing down on Raskolnikov, and the weather, the people, everything, it forms together to make this perfect picture. Another point, so you have some of the other characters. Sonia, she is a prostitute, and this podcast I listened to talked about how she's a very unconvincing prostitute. Besides the one time where you see her, like, in her bright clothes and makeup and everything, you almost can't picture her being that because of her character and just the way that she talks and acts, and she seems like one of the better characters in the story. Then you have Svidrigailov, that is the very weird name, it's hard to pronounce, and he's like the opposite of her, and he was my least favorite character. He was gross, and one thing is, in the end, you see that, so his life is fully motivated by pleasure. So whether he does something good, it's motivated by pleasure, or whether he does something bad, it's because he desires that. He just wants to be happy. So ultimately, his life ends because he has nothing to live for anymore and no more pleasure. And he, lives fully for himself. Definitely do not like that character. I spent the whole book hating Raskolnikov and thinking he was horrible. And then you get to Svidrigailov and you're like, Oh, okay, so it can get worse. Then, so one thing that I didn't really like about this book is that Dostoevsky, he definitely blurs the line between bad and good, and he does this on purpose. A lot of writers do, because you have to realize that in the real life, there is no, like, this person is a completely good person and they never do anything bad, or this person's completely evil and they never do anything good. The lines are kind of blurred, and you want to, like, really hate someone in a book and just say, oh, they're the evil villain, like, they need to get their punishment, but there's always some, like, quality that you think is good in them. So Dostoevsky does a really great job of kind of blurring the lines, because you get to see the different people's perspective and see what's going on in their own lives and their own thoughts. Luzhin, I think is how you pronounce his name. Also didn't really like him, but he was a pretty boring character, and he basically, just wants to use people for his own purposes. I don't really know how to explain his character, and I just kind of didn't like the parts with him in it because he had no depth, and I would never want to actually meet him in real life, because all he cares about is just getting what he wants, basically. And last point is, in the book there is some, like, comedy, which is funny to say because the whole book is really depressing and gross, but there's just, like, this one part, there's a funeral meal, and it ends up being, like, really funny, just the way that it happens, and Dostoevsky, I think, put it in there for, like, some comic relief. And there's this quote, and there's definitely my favorite quote in there, and someone calls another lady, "You vile Prussian chicken leg in a crinoline." So that's my new favorite insult. It was really funny. So that's kind of my quick review of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I think I'm gonna take a break from Russian books. Wait, actually, I do have the Solzhenitsyn book that I bought the other day, and I have on my bookshelf ready to read. So I guess I'll read that one, but it's much shorter, so I feel like it's less of a waste of time if it turns out really depressing and a 2-star book like Crime and Punishment did. Okay, and the next book I read was Dust by Kara Swanson. And this is a retelling, well, not really retelling, but a spin-off of Peter Pan. So it happens much later, and Neverland has kind of been, like, destroyed, and so then they have to go and fix it. I just started listening to book number 2, and I feel like the biggest problem with this book is, you know how there's series where it's like everything's contained in one book, and then you kind of continue with the next characters in the next book, and then there's series where it's almost like the book was just cut off in the middle of the story, and then you just pick right back up in the next book. And I don't necessarily like that as much, because then you feel like you're going through the whole first book and there's no conclusion, so you feel like you kind of wasted all this time. Like, why did it take so long for them to get to this point, and then I still have to read another book? So I didn't like that about it. I did give it 4 stars, and I normally don't like fantasy books, but I did like this book. So this month I found some cool fantasy books that are outside of my normal genre, but I actually did like them. Peter in the book, Peter Pan, is really sweet, and I don't want to spoil a lot, but the pixie dust is really cool. And the author is really interesting. So I don't believe she's Christian, but I did see that she grew up in a missionary home. So I think that a lot of those things that she grew up with influence her writing, even though it's not explicitly there. So I did see some good Christian messages. The one thing I would say about this book is if you're trying to steer, like, completely away from any type of romance or infatuation, then don't read this book, because there can be parts where it dwells on it a little too much. And there's one scene where there's a kiss that's a little too detailed, but I do really like the whole point of it, and how she says, you know, everyone has one kiss that they save for a certain someone, and you shouldn't go just throwing that around. So I really kind of like that message, even if the scene wasn't the best. And then the ending was neat, because she kind of realizes, like, oh, I don't need someone else to define me. I don't need to be a man pleaser. Like, I can be defined by who God made me to be, and just appreciate those gifts that God has given us, and not always trying to get affirmation from man. So I thought that was cool. Yeah, and it's really nice. I was like, okay, guys, please don't lie to a girl trying to get her to like you, and keeping things from her so that maybe she'll like you better, because in the end, in the words of Han Solo, she will always find out. So please do not do that. That's the message of this book. So I did like this book, and I am reading the next one right now. So we'll see in my March video. I will do a review of that. And then The Last Bookshop in London was a 5-star book this month, and besides Gentle and Lowly, that is my favorite book. So it's a historical fiction. It has a little bit of love in it, but mostly it's about just like the power and the magic of books. So it's set in London in World War II, and there's all these bombings and everything, and this girl goes to work for a bookstore, and she learns, wow, I can read books and be transported to a different world, and it draws people together, and it's so sweet, and it will definitely inspire you to go read more books and to tell other people about books, because it's such a great like conversation topic. You can read books together, and you can really relate to people. I like how she brought out like you can understand other people better whenever you read, because you're kind of in the minds of other people, and you can see, oh, that's why this person I know in real life acts like that. So it kind of helps you to have more grace for people. So I really enjoyed this book, and would definitely recommend that you go pick up The Last Bookshop in London. And if you have any other historical fiction books like that, please let me know, because it's so rare to find clean historical fiction, and this one was so clean and so good and so sweet. So I really like that one. And then the last book I read this month was Disciplines of a Godly Woman, and I started this way back in January and just now finished it. And it is a book on the different disciplines that a Christian woman should have. I enjoyed it as a basic book on these disciplines, but I didn't feel like it was one of those books that just like threw something at you and your whole life was changed, and it was just so amazing, new information. I felt like it was a little bit basic, and there was a couple of interpretive issues that I didn't really like, so I think I only ended up giving it 3 stars. I will be looking, I think like The Excellent Wife is supposedly better on the topic of these disciplines that we should grow and cultivate in our life, so I will probably be reading that one soon. So this was a much longer video than I hoped it would be, but there was a lot of books this month that I just had to spend a little bit more time on, and I had a lot of thoughts on. So if you'd like any of these books that I have mentioned today, if you would like me to do a video just on those, let me know, and I can totally do that. And also go check me out on Goodreads and Instagram. I will give reviews of the books that I'm reading closer to when I read them, and not wait so long like on a video. So if you want to see more frequent updates, definitely check out Goodreads and Instagram. I'll post the ones that I really like on there. So thank you for being here for this video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next week. Bye.